The message notification lights up your phone. Heart racing, you open it, convinced this time will be different. Sorry, I can't make it tonight after all. Something came up. The third cancellation in 2 weeks from someone who, just days earlier, couldn't get enough of you. You send a response asking if everything's okay, watching as the message is read. Hours pass. Nothing. By morning, your profile is blocked. All traces of your connection erased without explanation. The particular sting of being ghosted by someone who once showered you with attention creates a wound unlike any other. It's not just rejection. It's the maddening absence of closure, the abrupt shift from being the center of someone's universe to being discarded without explanation. What makes this experience especially disorienting is the pattern. Why does it keep happening with different people who somehow end up behaving in eerily similar ways? What if these painful cycles aren't random bad luck, but evidence of deeper psychological mechanisms at work? The revolutionary insights of psychoanalysis offer a surprising framework for understanding why certain personality types repeatedly enter our lives. Though never swiping through dating profiles or experiencing the unique pain of modern ghosting, the pioneers of depth psychology identified unconscious patterns that illuminate even our most contemporary relationship struggles. Our unconscious mind influences far more of our romantic choices than we realize. That magnetic pull towards certain personality types, that familiar dance of idealization followed by devaluation, that sense of being drawn to someone despite red flags. These experiences may not be coincidental, but signals from your unconscious recreating familiar emotional landscapes. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't just explain why narcissistic personalities repeatedly enter your life. It can free you from patterns that keep you trapped in cycles of idealization and abandonment. When someone suddenly disappears after intense interest, we naturally turn inward, examining everything we might have done wrong. Sometimes, specific dynamics do trigger narcissistic responses that create distance. But more profoundly, the initial attraction itself, that powerful chemistry that feels so right, may be rooted in unconscious patterns established far earlier than you realize. You're different from anyone I've ever met. We connect on such a deep level. Those intoxicating early stages of dating a narcissistic personality feature a particular kind of idealization that creates one of the most powerful bonds in adult relationships. The feeling of being singled out as special, of being seen more clearly and valued more highly than anyone else has ever managed, creates an almost addictive emotional high. But this experience often signals something more complex than exceptional compatibility. The unconscious mind constantly seeks to resolve unfinished emotional business from childhood. When someone places you on a pedestal, seemingly understanding your deepest self, they may actually be mirroring patterns from your earliest attachments, for better or worse. This recognition feels like destiny rather than repetition. Consider a common scenario. After several disappointing relationships, you meet someone who immediately feels different. Their attention is intoxicating, almost overwhelming. They text constantly, want to see you every day, and seem fascinated by details of your life others find mundane. This powerful connection creates the sensation of having found someone who truly appreciates your worth. What's often happening is a sophisticated form of pattern recognition. Your unconscious identifying emotional dynamics that match your earliest experiences of conditional love. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between healthy intensity and unhealthy obsession. It simply recognizes patterns. If your childhood featured inconsistent validation, moments of being treated as special, followed by periods of emotional neglect, you may be unconsciously drawn to partners who recreate this dynamic. The exhilarating highs feel like destiny. The devastating lows feel inexplicable. This pattern creates particular confusion because the initial connection feels uniquely positive. Your conscious mind registers the intense focus and validation as evidence of exceptional compatibility. Your unconscious recognizes the familiar emotional landscape, including the potential for familiar pain. This disconnect between conscious interpretation and unconscious recognition creates the perfect conditions for seemingly inexplicable cycles of idealization and discard. I think we need to talk about how you made me feel when you were talking to your friend at the party. Direct confrontation of a narcissist's behavior activates one of the most fundamental psychological drives, the impulse to seek pleasure and avoid pain. When faced with potentially uncomfortable conversations that require accountability, many narcissistic personalities choose avoidance or attack over engagement, not from calculated malice, but from basic psychological self-protection. This avoidance mechanism operates almost automatically. The person who seemed fully invested suddenly becomes distant or hostile when the relationship requires navigating emotional complexity that threatens their self-image. Their unconscious calculates the discomfort of difficult communication against the relief of simple avoidance or counterattack. Without strong countervailing forces, avoidance or aggression often wins. Dating landscapes are filled with this dynamic. The relationship progresses smoothly until a boundary needs discussion, a behavior requires examination, or emotional vulnerability deepens beyond comfortable limits. One person attempts to address the issue directly, the other becomes increasingly distant, defensive, or disappears completely rather than engaging with discomfort that challenges their carefully constructed self-image. This avoidance isn't necessarily conscious calculation. The person doesn't explicitly think, "This conversation would require me to acknowledge fault, so I'll ghost instead." Rather, they experience growing unease, a vague sense of being unfairly criticized, and find themselves too busy to respond, or suddenly discovering incompatibilities that weren't issues days before. The conscious mind provides rational justifications for what the unconscious has already decided: avoid the discomfort at all costs. What makes this pattern particularly confusing is its selective application. The same person who disappears rather than discussing relationship concerns might be perfectly capable of difficult conversations in contexts where their self-image isn't threatened. The pleasure principle operates most powerfully around narcissistic wounds, where emotional stakes feel highest and unconscious patterns run deepest. My mother always made everything about her feelings. Whenever I accomplished something, somehow it became about how proud she was instead of my achievement. The psychological mechanism of transference, projecting feelings, expectations, and patterns from past relationships onto current ones, creates some of the most confusing dynamics in relationships with narcissistic personalities. When someone unconsciously reminds us of important figures from our past, we respond not just to who they are, but to all the emotional associations they trigger. This transference operates without conscious awareness. The date who displays a specific emotional pattern that resembles a narcissistic parent activates entire relationship templates from the past. Your responses become shaped not just by the current interaction, but by the accumulated emotional history attached to similar patterns. Dating experiences frequently feature this dynamic. A potentially promising connection suddenly shifts when certain patterns emerge that unconsciously remind you of a self-centered parent. The attraction may actually intensify rather than diminish because the unconscious seeks to resolve old wounds through repeated exposure. The familiarity of navigating someone else's fragile ego feels strangely comfortable despite its obvious challenges. A common example: someone raised by a parent who required constant admiration and emotional caretaking meets a date who similarly needs excessive validation. Though consciously recognizing these behaviors as problematic, they find themselves automatically providing the accommodation and support these behaviors demand. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between past and present sources of similar dynamics. The response is to the entire pattern, not just the current trigger. What makes transference particularly powerful in relationships with narcissistic personalities is how it creates complementary roles. The person accustomed to accommodating narcissistic needs unconsciously signals this capacity from the earliest interactions. The narcissistic personality unconsciously recognizes the perfect counterpart to their emotional requirements. This mutual recognition creates powerful initial chemistry that feels like compatibility rather than complementary wounds. "I'm not sure I'm ready for a relationship right now. Things are so complicated with my ex-job life situation." Just as the relationship deepens beyond the initial idealization phase, narcissistic personalities often deploy one of the most common self-protective mechanisms: the sudden creation of external barriers to intimacy. While consciously pursuing connection in the early stages, the unconscious mind often fears the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy, creating protective distance precisely when authentic emotional connection becomes possible. This self-protective mechanism operates beneath awareness. The person who seemed eager for commitment suddenly discovers complications when real emotional intimacy emerges. Their unconscious calculates the vulnerability required for deep connection against the potential threat to their carefully constructed self-image. Without conscious intervention, self-protection often prevails. Dating patterns frequently demonstrate this dynamic. The relationship progresses intoxicatingly through initial stages of mutual idealization. External obstacles to the relationship seem trivial or non-existent during this phase. When emotional intimacy deepens, when real vulnerability enters the equation, external circumstances suddenly become insurmountable barriers. A typical scenario. After several promising weeks or months characterized by intense attention and apparent emotional openness, one person begins referencing outside complications just as the relationship requires more authentic vulnerability. "My ex is still in the picture," they might say, or "My work situation is too demanding right now," or "I'm not emotionally available because of everything I'm dealing with." These barriers weren't mentioned during the intense pursuit phase, but suddenly become critical once deeper intimacy looms. This pattern creates particular confusion because the timing seems coincidental rather than psychological. The person experiencing these external complications often genuinely believes in their significance, not recognizing their convenient emergence precisely when emotional vulnerability deepens. Their disappearance isn't calculated deception, but unconscious self-protection, a pattern they themselves may not understand. "I keep attracting people who love bomb me at first, and then suddenly grow cold and critical. I'm starting to think something's wrong with me." Perhaps the most perplexing psychological mechanism in relationships with narcissistic personalities is unconscious self-sabotage, the tendency to be repeatedly drawn to people who recreate painful dynamics we consciously want to avoid. This pattern stems from a paradoxical aspect of human psychology. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar healing. This self-defeating mechanism operates beneath conscious intention. The person who repeatedly attracts narcissistic personalities isn't consciously choosing pain. Rather, their unconscious is seeking the emotional landscape it knows how to navigate, even when that landscape causes suffering. The very behaviors that unconsciously signal relationship material to them may be precisely the red flags they consciously know to avoid. Dating experiences often reveal these self-sabotaging patterns. Someone with a history of narcissistic relationships unconsciously responds more strongly to the familiar emotionally charged pursuit than to healthier, more moderated interest. The exhilarating highs of idealization feel like exceptional connection rather than warning signs. These powerful responses aren't conscious choices but unconscious recreations of familiar emotional scenarios. Consider the common pattern. Someone attempts to break their cycle of narcissistic relationships by consciously identifying red flags and setting boundaries. Yet they find themselves inexplicably drawn to people who display these very warning signs, feeling more chemistry with them than with emotionally healthier prospects. This attraction doesn't reflect their conscious values, but their unconscious comfort with familiar emotional dynamics. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is its self-confirming nature. Each relationship that follows this pattern reinforces the belief that intense initial chemistry inevitably leads to painful discarding. This belief then justifies further caution in future connections, while simultaneously preserving the unconscious draw toward the very dynamics consciously identified as harmful. The deeper understanding of these psychological mechanisms offers something more valuable than dating tactics. It provides liberation from self-blame when narcissistic patterns repeat in your life. Being repeatedly ghosted or discarded by people who initially pursued you intensely often triggers crushing self-criticism, a painful excavation of personal flaws that might explain these repeated experiences. The psychological reality is far more complex. When you repeatedly attract narcissistic personalities, you're often responding to unconscious templates established in your earliest relationships rather than consciously choosing pain. Understanding this doesn't guarantee immediate change, but it preserves self-worth amid painful patterns. This perspective shifts the narrative from personal inadequacy to psychological patterns. The question transforms from, "What's wrong with me that I keep attracting narcissists?" to, what unconscious mechanisms might be operating here. This reframing doesn't eliminate disappointment, but reduces its destructive power over self-perception. Recognition of these patterns creates the possibility of intervention. When you notice yourself powerfully drawn to someone who creates the familiar emotional cocktail of intense pursuit followed by subtle devaluation, you might pause to examine what specific qualities trigger that recognition. When relationships repeatedly follow similar painful patterns, recognizing unconscious self-sabotage creates space for different choices before the cycle completes again. The most valuable insight might be recognizing that attracting narcissistic personalities often reveals more about your early attachment patterns than your inherent worth. Someone drawn to your capacity for emotional caretaking, your responsiveness to intermittent reinforcement, or your willingness to prioritize their needs demonstrates compatibility with unconscious patterns, not an accurate assessment of your value. This understanding doesn't justify hurtful behavior, but contextualizes it within human psychological functioning. The person who discards without explanation after intense pursuit isn't necessarily calculating their behavior. They're often unconsciously repeating patterns they themselves don't understand. The freedom in this perspective comes from recognizing that repeated attraction to narcissistic personalities, particularly when it follows consistent patterns, rarely reflects personal failing. It more often reveals the operation of unconscious templates established before conscious choice was possible. Templates that can be modified with awareness and intention. This insight doesn't eliminate the pain of narcissistic discard, but transforms its meaning. The abandonment becomes less a judgment of personal value and more a revelation of psychological compatibility with unconscious patterns. This perspective preserves self-worth amid disappointment, allowing forward movement without the burden of unwarranted self-criticism. The ultimate wisdom in understanding these psychological mechanisms isn't in avoiding narcissistic personalities through hypervigilance, but in recognizing their draw before emotional investment deepens. This awareness creates space for compassion, both for those caught in narcissistic patterns and for ourselves when facing the pain of repeated abandonment. The ghosting phenomenon, when viewed through this psychological lens, becomes less a modern dating tragedy and more an opportunity for deeper self-understanding. When someone disappears after intense pursuit, the question worth asking isn't, "What did I do wrong?" but "What does this reveal about the psychological patterns at play in both of us?" This perspective doesn't eliminate disappointment, but transforms it from evidence of personal inadequacy to information about relational patterns. This reframing preserves the core of self-worth that narcissistic discard often erodes, allowing forward movement without the weight of unexamined self-doubt. The greatest freedom might be recognizing that attraction requires psychological compatibility, not just in interests or values, but in how two unconscious minds interact. When this fundamental compatibility manifests as narcissistic pursuit, followed by abandonment, it reveals complementary wounds rather than unique connection. Understanding this reality doesn't guarantee immediately breaking narcissistic attraction patterns, but it does protect against the soul, eroding belief that these patterns equal unworthiness. Some minds naturally seek caretaking, others naturally provide it. This isn't personal failure, but psychological reality, a perspective that liberates from the burden of self-blame. The next time you find yourself powerfully drawn to someone whose attention feels intoxicating, who seems to see you more clearly and value you more highly than anyone else ever has, consider the unconscious mechanisms that might be operating beneath the surface. This perspective doesn't diminish genuine connection, but contextualizes powerful attraction within psychological patterns that may signal either healing potential or repeated wounding. This understanding offers something more valuable than tactics for preventing narcissistic attraction. It provides resilience when patterns temporarily repeat, despite awareness. The freedom in this perspective comes from recognizing that unconscious templates formed in childhood require patience to modify. This insight preserves self-compassion amid the gradual process of changing attraction patterns. In a dating landscape where narcissistic pursuit often gives way to ghosting, understanding these psychological mechanisms provides a crucial shield against the erosion of self-worth. The person who ghosts after intense pursuit demonstrates limited psychological resources. limitations that would eventually constrain intimacy, regardless of how promising the beginning seemed. This perspective transforms ghosting from personal rejection to psychological information, valuable data about unconscious compatibility rather than damning evidence of inadequacy. This reframing doesn't eliminate disappointment, but reduces its power to diminish self-perception. The question becomes not, why wasn't I enough? But what does this reveal about psychological patterns I'm ready to transform? The greatest wisdom might be recognizing that the very intensity that makes connections with narcissistic personalities feel exceptional also makes them inherently unstable. When powerful attraction stems from complementary wounds rather than authentic compatibility, it inevitably creates relationships characterized by idealization followed by devaluation. Understanding this complexity doesn't guarantee perfect protection from narcissistic attraction, but offers increasing ability to distinguish between genuine connection and familiar wounding patterns. The freedom lies not in perfect avoidance, but in progressively earlier recognition, in noticing the signs of narcissistic patterns, while emotional investment remains minimal enough for clean extraction. What first appears as exceptional chemistry may indeed contain elements of genuine compatibility. It may also reflect the recognition of familiar emotional patterns, comfortable in their predictability despite their eventual pain. The liberation comes not in determining which explanation is correct, but in approaching powerful attraction with both openness and awareness, allowing space for both the possibility of healthy connection and the reality of psychological patterns that have shaped our experience of love.